You're listening to the I Love You Keep Going podcast with George Haas. For more information, please visit our website at www.mettagroup.org. That's www.mettagroup.org.
So welcome, everybody. This is I Love You Keep Going. It is April 27th, 2023 at 7:36 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. And I was going to talk tonight about meditation and addiction. We're doing a workshop coming up, not this Saturday, but the following Saturday for 3 Saturdays from 9 to 1, basically. But we got started talking about something before the group started it. And I think we should just continue that conversation and then slide into the meditation and addiction. Hesh, can you just sort of prime it for people?
Sure. I was describing this experience that I'm noticing where it seems that in parallel to what seems like the primary view or experience of self in the moment, there is this more kind of frozen in time biographical reference to a self that is very limited by what I think is my early conditioning, and that's showing up and maybe demanding a little bit of attention, but it doesn't seem to be. It seems more like there's an A/B choice than there has before, and I'm attributing it to some equanimity on practice that I've been doing.
Mm-hmm. So we have the capacity to sense, touching, seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling, and then we have mind. Mind, as a sense activity, directs your attention to what you're going to focus on. So that when the sensing array is open and there's constant contact from a range of objects in the full range of the sensing experience, the mind sort of zeroes in and focuses on a particular sensing experience. When there's contact then between the sensing experience, the capacity to sense it, and the mind chooses it, it opens into consciousness. Now, not the consciousness of self, but the consciousness of the being. You don't know this part because it isn't usually presented to the self experience, which is really all we know. Then it's evaluated for processing speed, I like to call it. Vaden is often translated as, is it pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, the sensing experience of it. But that's only part of it. The other part of it is, do we need to attend to this now because we're in danger? The saber-toothed tiger is leaping out of the bush and we need to get out of the way, and we need to get out of the way fast. And so it jumps to the head of the line of sensing. But it also does mean, is the sensing experience itself pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, right? In traditional Theravada Buddhism, all sensing experience is neutral except for the body and pressure. So all auditory sensing experience is neutral, but if it's really loud, it's the pressure of the loudness that can be unpleasant. If all visual experience is neutral, but if it's really bright, the pressure of the brightness can be unpleasant, right? The body, though, can have sensations which are painful that without the combination of pressure can be considered unpleasant, but then also you have the capacity of the body to feel pleasant sensations. The other senses don't really have that. If it jumps to the head of the line, then it's immediately compared to the perceptual database, and this is where your conditioning comes in. We have the undifferentiated, raw, vibratory, unfixated sensing experience, which is just happening, doesn't have any meaning, doesn't have any associations, is not even solid. And then if there's an entry in the database that's close enough to what the pattern of the sensing is, something that's already been processed, already been defined, then it attaches to the raw, undifferentiated, ultimate sensing experience, and that rolls into conceptual reality. which has all of the meaning attached to it in your previous experiences. So when you recognize that you're in the present moment, but the meaning you're making out of it is not actually all the present moment, then that's the awareness of your conditioning. If you don't stay in the present moment, you can easily, and this happens a lot, you can easily slip into the meaning that you've made out of it. And then you're no longer in the present moment, you're in the meaning. This is where the habits, the samsara, the repetition of conditioning happens. You slip out of the present moment into the conditioning, and then what happened in the past becomes the limit of what can happen now. So you lose track of all of the other sensing experiences. I mean, all of the other possibilities that could happen in the present moment, and you simply choose from the limited range of things that have already happened. Is that making sense so far? So it sounds like you're at that piece where you can recognize that the view is limiting your awareness of the possibilities that are there. If you think about it, and I like the quantum mechanics aspect of this because it seems like a good metaphor and maybe actually be something that's happening. In each moment, what opens up is all of the possibilities that you could choose, the full range of possibilities. But if you don't understand what they are, if you can't see them, if you're frightened of them, then they narrow down to the range of things that you think that you can take, the thing that you think that you can have. Then you choose that, and that's what the conceptual reality becomes. And all of the other possibilities then disappear. You know, it's the wave or is it the particle? It's a wave until you pick a particle, and then it's a particle and the wave is gone. And then what opens up in the next moment, in Buddhism, we call this knowledge of conditionality. What opens up in the next moment is all of the possibilities that are linked to the one you just picked. So when you think about it, the vastness of the possibilities 2 or 3 choices down that you didn't take. I mean, just a vast array of them. And then if you notice that because you keep making conceptual reality the same, and that conceptual reality only comes with 2 or 3 choices, you keep making the same 2 or 3 choices. We call that samsara, that habit of repeating. So this is a great place to be in practice because you're opening up and seeing this, the conditioning, the meaning that you make out of the present moment doesn't match actually perfectly with the conditions of the present moment. And if you push more into that, you'll see that there's more choices that you could take. We were talking about how to repair this, and one of the things we talk about is the ideal parent figure protocol. But the reason that the ideal parent figure protocol is so effective is because you're intentionally loading the perceptual database with these entries of different possibilities than the things that happen to you. We do have imagination built into the system, which is usable for these things. But one of the things that happens in early conditioning, particularly if it's averse early conditioning, is that we, as children in a defense against painful experiences, begin to pinch, I like to say, pinch off the imagination. We begin to limit our capacity to imagine certain things because the imagining of them and then the not being able to get them over and over again is so painful that it becomes a self-preservation activity to limit the imagination. In really adverse childhood situations, the imagination and the capacity to imagine is really truncated in a lot of areas. You can do the work to reclaim the imagination in those areas. That's also something that the ideal parent figure protocol does really well. But if you don't do that, and you hit into a novel experience, you can't imagine a solution to it that's different than what you've always done, and you go back to the habit energy of what's happened. But with the ideal parent figure protocol, because you're using the imagination to fill in the database with different possibilities, ideal possibilities, when that process unfolds, the capacity to sense, having contact with the sense object, the consciousness of that arising, it's being evaluated for urgency, and then it's compared to the database. The database and the forming of conceptual reality is always how it works. It doesn't matter whether it happened or it didn't happen. Does it matter whether it happened and you imagined it happening? Because conceptual reality is not based on what happens, it's based on what's in the database. You put something in the database, conceptual reality can form based around that belief as easily as anything else. And you can see this.
You're saying there's not going to be any new keys on this piano until we do replace some of it.
You have to put some new keys, or you just have to tune it, you know.
Yeah.
Okay. You have, I'm sure, had the experience of people getting these ideas into their heads which don't seem to be based on anything substantial, and yet absolutely believing them and absolutely acting in the world as if what they're thinking is true. And I think that's one of these ideas. One idea, of course, that I've encountered this week, which I quite like, is that, and this is, I think, Thomas Merton. Life is difficult. It's not difficult for everybody, even though everybody's circumstances are different. The not wanting life to be difficult is the problem, not that life is difficult, because you suffer so much from not wanting it to be difficult. Whereas if your expectation is this is going to be difficult, then you're prepared to engage in the terms of life, the terms of this human condition, which I think is a good thing. Everybody's difficult is different too. We also we do not know what's happening. That is not the human conundrum. We know what we think is happening. And it could be, or it could not be, what's happening. That doesn't matter so much as whether we think it. Because if we think it's happening, for us, it's happening. And so you move out of these non-mentalizing stances of, I'm experiencing this, so it's happening, to this is what I'm experiencing, what are you experiencing? And seeing if there's some alignment, there's some match there. So you get, a different facet, somebody else's experience of what's happening, and so that you can have actually a richer, deeper understanding of what's happening. Possibly. This is what I think is happening. And I think it's happening because I have all of these definitions which I've applied to it, which creates the meaning that's based on my conditioning, not on anyone else's conditioning. Because everybody else's conditioning is different and everybody else's definitions are different. They're just organically, naturally, with no problem, creating a version of what's happening that maps onto their conditioning. So that actually is an interesting, I think that's one of the great things. You want to get somebody who's got a great database so they keep creating these versions of reality that are interesting to enrich your own version of what's happening. Is that making sense?
Can I ask a question about that conditioning, matched or unmatched? Sometimes I experience something like some kind of discord with a new person, and I'm trying to think about it as maybe there's just some dissonance in like this conditioning, and maybe there's like a flag that just didn't match their flag. How do you bridge that, or how do you see that?
We have a new brochure out called How to Date. What is it called? How to Date as if you're a secure person. How to date like a secure person, even if you're not yet secure.
Send me one.
The first thing you want to pay attention to in people is, do they emotionally regulate you? Because that's the most important thing that you need from them in order to be able to explore. So, from the attachment point of view, you need to develop your secure base so that you can rush back and get help when you need it. And then you want that group of people to push you out the door back into your exploration so you don't hide out because it's difficult. And then you want to explore really hard, really to the edge of meaning. And if you don't do that and you restrict that, by the time you're old, life, the difficulty of life is unbearable. You just don't want to do it because there's no richness, there's no meaningfulness in it. So you need to push out and find out the things that you need to know, that you need to know. Nobody else needs to know them. You need to know them, and you need to find those things out. And then you need to be able to rush back to this group of people that you've collected around you that are interested in hearing what you've found out. That's that sharing of it. But it's all based on the capacity for them to emotionally regulate you. So that's the thing you have to pay attention to. And you were talking about the complexity of that. Your conditioning needs to mesh with their conditioning. It's automatic, it's unconscious. And the way that you tell whether it's working is, do you feel better after 20 or 30 minutes of being with them? Do you feel the same or do you feel worse? It's possible to encounter somebody where your conditioning and their conditionings clash, and so you feel less dysregulated. And it's possible to meet somebody where not much happens. There's no regulation, there's no dysregulation. You only want to focus relational energy on people where you really mesh and you can co-regulate each other. But first, you have to look out for yourself. Am I regulated? If every time I see you, I'm regulated, then that's a relationship that's worthy of going to the next step in the investigation, which is, are you that regulating for them? If you're not that regulating for them, they won't put the energy into the relationship that you need to have a base to regulate from. So you have to match there. They're regulating for you and it's reliable, and you're regulating for them and it's reliable. Then what you need to do is figure out whether you like taking care of them in the way that they need to be taken care of. If you do not like to take care of them in the way that they need to be taken care of, they will feel not taken care of and complain, and the relationship will be constantly in strife. Then you have to find out whether they enjoy taking care of you in the way that you like to be taken care of, because if they don't, they won't do it enough, and you'll be the one who's complaining about your needs not being met in the relationship. If all four of those things are in place, then you have a foundation, and you can look at what most people look at in the beginning, which is whether you make good traveling companions. Do you like enough of the same thing? Are your interests the same? Is your money the same? Is all the rest of it the same? But if you don't have that base, then even if all of the other stuff works and you get dysregulated and rush back and they can't regulate you, then you end up in longer and longer periods of dysregulation. And the disappointment is the thing that accumulates and burns out the relationship. That in that moment, when you have the choice about really going for it or not really going for it, and you don't want to risk the emotional upset that might happen because there's nobody to catch you, then you begin to limit your exploration. It should be the opposite of that. You want to be really sure that if you need somebody to catch you, they're there to catch you so that you can take that risk and grab the meaning. Is that making sense? So if we shift a little bit and add the topic of addiction to that, addiction is an avoidant attachment strategy. And the idea there is that I don't want to have to rely on other people to regulate me because they're unreliable for that. And this is a fair evaluation one of the things about the attachment outcomes is when you get into an unfortunate attachment outcome, it's usually a very fair assessment of what happened. So if you have an avoidant attachment strategy, the reason you have an avoidant attachment strategy is that you were neglected, profoundly neglected. There wasn't anybody to count on. So when you imagine to yourself, you visualize to yourself exploring and going and doing things, you're always envisioning it as on your own, because that's what happened to you. Nobody ever came. Nobody was ever interested in what happened. If you had some kind of trauma or abuse and nobody helped you with that, then there's this profound belief that nobody's going to help you. So why put the energy into it? And if there was some kind of exploitation and you were betrayed by your caregivers, then the deep belief is that you're going to be betrayed if you rely on anybody. So it's better not to do that. But we do live in human bodies, and human bodies are designed to be emotionally co-regulating. We're designed to live in complex social groups. That's the body. And you can't really find a way or train the mind or do any of these things to be able to survive in isolation. And so the reason that addiction affects avoidant people so much is because they don't want to have to rely on anybody for emotional regulation. They don't want to have to rely on anybody really for much of anything. And that is a painful situation for the body to be in. So it reacts by generating pain. The attachment system goes off and it keeps getting more and more intense until you connect with somebody. If you've been around small children, the first thing they do is look as cute as they can, and then they look confused, and then they whimper, and then they intermittently cry, and then they continuously cry, and then they tantrum. If nobody comes, they fall off the cliff into anaclytic depression where they just shut down completely. Profoundly neglected kids often have that component. They don't rely on people. They don't believe people will help them. And they're in pain. And so what do? They look for things that address the pain. They look for things that are reliable to address their pain, that doesn't cause them to have to rely on other people. If it's substances, the problem with substance is tolerance. And I think that if they could come up with some substance that was a good painkiller that didn't develop tolerance, we would not have the I like to call them meth zombies, but that's because my neighborhood is overrun by, I live near downtown, so it's kind of overrun by people struggling with meth fentanyl 1-2 punch. So there you are, 2 puffs of weed, and my God, you feel like $1 million. It's fantastic. But then a few weeks later, it's not 2 puffs anymore. It's 5 puffs. Then it's a joint. Then it's 2 joints. Then it's 4 or 5 joints. And then you have to take something to enhance that. Maybe you have a half a glass of wine and that really does it. But then you develop a tolerance, and then it's a whole glass of wine. Then it's 2, then it's 3, then it's 5. And at a certain point, the dose gets so high that has the same soothing effect that it impairs your ability to function. And that's when you have the problem. That's when we complain about people who are using substances to regulate their emotions, because their tolerance develops to the point where the doses are so high to get the relief that they need that they're not able to function. And then they become dependent, the rest of us, to get by. With process addictions, it's more and more extreme. You start with pornography in a missionary position, and before you know it, you're into these wild, extreme sexual illustrations. Food, that first bite of cake is delicious. By the time you've eaten the whole cake, it's not so delicious, but you're still eating it because that action is what's relieving. So if we look at this and try to understand what we need to do about this, we begin to examine the mentalizing capacity much in the way that we would with any kind of attachment investigation and repair. Track your thoughts to see what you're thinking. We use Marlatt's. Marlatt was a researcher up at the University of Washington, and he looked into the main sequences or conduits for people relapsing, and we work with that. Craving and urging is one. We develop emotional regulation strategies. Most people use thinking, and we tend to learn the strategies that are in our family system. So if you come from a family system where there's a lot of drinking or other kinds of drug use, we witness those and learn how to do them, learn when to do them, and they become part of our tool bag of emotional regulation strategies. If you're out and about and you're in pain and you don't come from a family that uses process or substance addictions, but you jump into a peer group that does, you learn those habits there. There's a whole collection of emotional regulation strategies that's stored in the mind, and when something happens and the reaction to it exceeds the window of tolerance, that's the Dan Siegel model, and there's an emotional event that needs to be regulated, you go to the database. Everybody goes to the database and looks for the match. What emotional regulation strategies do I use for this? And if using is that strategy you think of using, geez, I need a drink after that. Your friend ODs next to you and you're trying to wake him up so you can find out what dealer he got it from because it looks so promising. The problem is not the spontaneous thought of using. The problem is the self-generated emotional process of using the thought of using as a self-soothing process. So you think of using and you've made a commitment not to use, and you remember times where using was nice, where you think that maybe using a little bit would be okay, and you allow the mind to engage in the fantasy of using. What's the problem with that if it does generate self-soothing? The problem is that there's an underlying stressor which is causing the mind to have an emotional reaction which exceeds the window of tolerance. And if you don't handle that stressor, it often becomes more distressing. And then the mind has to generate a more intense emotional response to regulate it. And as the cognitive mind decays and you go more into the procedural mind, you can get to the point where you can no longer tell that what you were thinking was a self-soothing fantasy, and you can't distinguish it from a plan of action. And then you find yourself spontaneously lapsing when you didn't want to. That leads to what we call the abstinence violation effect. You use, you didn't want to, you feel completely powerless, you feel shame, you feel guilt, you feel regret, which is another intense emotion that needs to be regulated, which often exceeds the window of tolerance, that then puts you into another loop. That happens a couple of times in your relapse. where you need it to be, to where you were before. The second thing that happens often in addiction is we call it stress, anger, and depression. You use afflictive strategies to regulate your emotion. You use anger or sadness or fear to regulate your emotions as the primary strategy. And those intense experiences of emotional regulation that you need to generate, to feel regulated, can get to the point that it overwhelms the system, and then the limbic system shuts down in order to allow those neurochemicals to be processed out by the liver and kidneys. And so you end up in a cycling depression. All that atypical cycling depression, which is very common in addicts. And that is totally tied to the thinking process. And you have to examine your thinking process and then replace those emotional regulation strategies with something more beneficial. This is, if you've been listened to our regular attachment work, this should sound quite familiar to you. You monitor your thoughts, you develop the mentalizing to see whether the strategies that you're using are to regulate yourself are beneficial or afflictive. You begin to suppress the afflictive ones and develop the beneficial ones so you can operate better. The third one is persistent negative emotions. We talk about the 4 kinds of emotions you need to know and have clarity around: present moment emotional reaction, the self-generated emotional reaction, the somaticized emotional reaction, which is the storing of overwhelming emotional experience, and the empathetic experience of other people. Addiction is an avoidant strategy, and avoidant people suppress awareness of their emotions. So they don't really have a good conscious link between their emotional distress and the pressure that it puts on them to use. And so part of this is to bring into consciousness the experience of emotion and embody it so that you can see that the reason why you are reacting with so much thinking about using in the present moment is because something in the present moment is upsetting you. And if you can recognize and tie the emotion to what that is, then you have agency to do something about the conditions of the present moment. So you're not so emotionally distressed. But if you don't allow yourself the knowledge of that, you don't know what's happening and you're just reacting. And if you've used for a long time, a lot of those reactions are going to be tied to using, and that is what's going to happen. When the system overloads, the emotion is dissociated and stuck into the body. We call it somaticized emotional experience. And in the, let's say, elaborate and not very effective emotional regulation strategy that most avoidant people use, there's often a lot of this somaticized emotion. It takes a ton of energy from other things and can be very intense when it releases. You don't have good clarity between the present moment, the self-generated emotion, the somaticized emotion. You can be operating at a 7 or 8 of emotional intensity when the present moment is really a 2 or a 3 at the most. So you're constantly overreacting and then taking actions that don't make sense to the other people around you that aren't in the level of distress that your, can I say, rickety emotional regulation system. And then the fourth one is the most pernicious, the one that really gets everybody, which is difficult interpersonal relationships. And this is the root of the attachment repair for addiction, which is to teach collaborative relationship systems so that you can be in relationships that actually are supportive and useful and not these puzzling, painful, repetitious experiences that really over and over again reinforce the idea that you don't want to be in close relationships. And so we open up into the attachment work there. The other thing that drives addiction is the exploration piece. Most people who are addicts don't explore for meaning; they explore for resources. So we talk about that as primary and secondary. In primary exploration, the activity that you're engaged in is the thing that's providing meaning. And so that's the thing that inflates life. That's the thing that carries you over the difficulty of life into finding out the things that you need to know. And if your exploration system is truncated and you're really only searching for things, power, money, position, getting over in some way so that you can transact your needs, all of those activities seem empty, which it contributes to the painfulness of life. But because of the conditions of your childhood where you weren't encouraged and supported, and in fact often rejected by the things that actually meant something to you, that gets all squashed and it's hidden and kept secret. And there's a terrible fearfulness around revealing that to anybody because the rejection in childhood was so harsh around that. Then you have to, little by little, trust someone that you can share that deeply personal pursuit of meaningfulness and get a reaction that's good, that's supportive, that provides that secure base. If you can't do that, if you can't learn to build relationships which are supportive of your exploration, it's very difficult to stay clean and out of the processed addictions for very long, because the painfulness of life, the difficulty of aging and all the rest of it catches up. Is that making sense? We have the additional burden now of the P2P meth and fentanyl. I don't know if you follow your street drugs much, but methamphetamine used to be based on ephedrine, which was created a euphoric drug experience. The prohibition of drugs, the criminalization of a medical problem, restricted the access of ephedrine from the manufacturers of illicit drugs, to the point that they shifted the source of the chemicals that they used from pharmaceutical grade to fertilizer grade. And they created a similar formula to meth that is manufactured from these really ordinary agricultural chemicals. The advantage to them, of course, is that there's no way that we can restrict those chemicals. They're widely available everywhere. They're not, in a sense, manufactured with a purity that would make sense to use as a drug. The problem with the P2P meth is that it's not euphoric. So you take a substance that's supposed to be euphoric and it isn't euphoric, but has all of the other characteristics of, energy and awakeness. And so they added fentanyl because fentanyl is euphoric. It is also hugely addictive. So now what we have is P2P meth with fentanyl, which is this highly addictive substance, which causes, they think, permanent cognitive impairment from moderate use over a short period of time. You see the danger that we are in, the danger that our fellow citizens are in if they get to a place where they've turned away from all people and they need something to help them when they're in great pain. So what's the solution? Well, we could just flood ephedrine back out there and get rid of the new meth. If you're on this new stuff, and it is not everywhere yet. It's here in Southern California because they manufacture most of it in Mexico, and it's an easy slip across the border. But it's going to go the way it always does. We need to do something fast. So I'm just saying this. So if you have the opportunity to advocate with anybody to get them to listen, that we need to decriminalize all of this, and we need to make available to people who are strung out safe drugs for them to take. It's not like we can simply say this is unsafe, you shouldn't take it. They're taking it already. And as for treatment, then it takes about 6 months for the cognitive aspect of the mind to come back the way that it does. So in terms of treatment, it's very different. We used to take people in and sober them up, and then after a month or 2 months, they'd be more or less on their feet. And now really what it looks like is 6 months of just holding until their cognitive minds come back up. We don't do that in our culture. We just don't do it. We need to do it, but we don't. So I do also hope that when you look at addiction through the attachment lens, that you'll see that this is conditioning, early conditioning, and that if you have the conditioning that puts you into an avoidance strategy, about 30% of dismissing adults have addiction issues. If you had trauma, if you had some kind of abuse, 70% of disorganized people have addiction. So you're looking at a population of people that function already poorly, and then on top of that, they have this addiction as well. That's, I guess, my advocacy for recognizing the underlying attachment difficulty that people have. The thing that causes relapse for people that are trying to stay clean is isolation, social isolation. It's too painful. And so if there isn't some way to help teach how to be in collaborative relationships, it's very difficult not to fall back into the social isolation. One of the things that's great about meditation communities is that we can make space for people that are having trouble with relationships. COVID has been terrible for this because most of the in-person centers have closed, and the online stuff is not really good enough for this. So I am hoping that as we adapt to this will change. How's that? Enough? So why don't we do some meditation? Can you still hear the bell? But now not. Good. So how did that go? Good enough.
was good. I had an easy person come straight to mind, and I liked the going back and forth to make sure the state was there.
In 2 weeks, we'll have the meditation and addiction training. And if that's of interest, come along. We're going to do the 4 modules over the 3 days. And then what else? I'm having an in-person retreat in Utrecht in June, and then also a short retreat, a 2-day retreat in Oakland at the end of June, I think. That one is called "I Love You, Keep Going," which is on how to operate collaborative relationship systems. So that's what that is. And we're doing our level 1s and our level 2s. Take a look at the calendar. Really appreciate your practice. I offer the class on a Dana basis, which means I offer the teaching freely, but I do hope that if you're able to make a donation, that you will. There's a link on the website to do that. Any amount is appreciated. It helps support me and also the work that Mettagroup is doing. I hope to see you soon. Bye.